Hello, and welcome to the podcast series from the Law Center for Health and Life at the University of Amsterdam. In this series, we look at societal challenges at the intersection of law, human health, and our living environment. I'm your host, Katrina Perehudoff. Today, we'll talk about access to COVID-19 vaccines. We'll discuss how EU and international law and politics influence how vaccines are developed, produced, and traded, and how this is all translated into inequitable vaccine distribution. To shed some light on Europe's role in vaccine access, I'll be speaking to Anniek de Ruijter, Associate Professor of EU Health Law and Policy at the University of Amsterdam and Director of the Law Center for Health and Life. Later, to lay out the potential for a more cooperative global vaccine policy, I'll speak to Professor Suerie Moon, Director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute Geneva. So today, we're here to talk about vaccines. And this is a really unique topic because it brings together two focal points of the research going on in our center. Mm-hmm. One on governance of health emergencies, and the other on access to medicines.
Yes.
And certainly there's been a lot of movement around vaccines, development and delivery in the last few months. Yep. We've seen this sort of slow game of panic football going on at the level of the European Union. And as we look over to the other side to across the ocean, it's left some of us questioning whether our EU institutions, whether our European Medicines Agency, whether the joint procurement mechanism, is that really fit for purpose?
Yeah.
And it's also left us wondering a number of other things, like the EU's role in the global rollout of vaccines. We can't forget the EU is not acting in a vacuum, and the decisions that we make here at home have an impact on people beyond our borders. Yep. So I think this is a really timely issue to unpack. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'd actually like to invite you, because you've worked so much in this field for the last few years. And I'd like to hear from you, if you reflect on the European Commission and its joint procurement mechanism, would you say that worked? Has it been successful in what it set out to do?
So at this point, I think if we all read the news, it's going to be hard to say that it was super successful, because obviously the EU is lagging behind on the rollout of vaccines right now. But if I compare it in history to how it was during swine flu, then actually this was quite a success for the European Union. So a lot of times in the news we see the EU being compared to the US or to the UK. But we shouldn't forget that the nature of those political systems and also the legal systems is completely different. The UK is one country. The US has a long history of federalism and also public health, so more or less harmonization of public health, of the public health authorities. The capacities in those countries is a lot different. And in the EU, we've only started just now. We've only basically started during swine flu, when everybody saw that at the time as well, the UK was hoarding all the vaccines, or many of the vaccines that were available, that member states were being played out against one another in accessing the swine flu vaccine, that the EU should step up, coordinate, and perhaps even jointly procure vaccines. Now, if you look at what happened during COVID, all of that did happen in a much more coordinated fashion. So if we look in history, we can see that, yes, we've moved much further along. We're doing this much better than we did before. But if we compare it to much more unified political systems, obviously the EU is not doing as well.
So what you're saying is, what I'm hearing from you is that the EU, with its 27 member states, faces some governance challenges, faces some challenges around maybe fragmentation that other countries like the United States don't. And that's one of the reasons why maybe Europe was slow to get moving on its response.
Exactly, because at the time the EU didn't have the money readily available. So imagine having to put together funding from 27 member states, and also at the same time negotiating the rules and the regulation under which you can spend that money. Those are all things that there was something in place, because there was some regulation that was being created after swine flu, but nothing at the scale or even the level of centralization that was needed to cope with the challenge that we had, that we faced as a European Union with COVID.
I see, and what I enjoy about talking to you about this is that you've been following this topic for a number of years, and I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how it directly relates to your research.
So I've always been interested in the increasing power or the increasing presence of the European Union in the field of health, even outside of the regulatory ability or competence to do so. So in the treaties, the EU has very limited power in the field of health, yet there are medicines, there's food safety, there is even cross-border access to healthcare. So there's a lot, actually. There's not an area of our healthcare system where the EU is not involved and where the EU is not de facto also regulating. So what is going on in this puzzle? This is a puzzle that I thought was very interesting also for my thesis. And this area of emergencies, health emergencies, is a perfect case study for that, for seeing that happen, where when it's needed, regardless of regulatory basis, in terms of policy and coordination and through softer policy-making mechanisms, the EU is actually quite powerful in the field of health.
So if we could actually consider export bans, which we're seeing now, the EU is imposing them on vaccines, so that's essentially an act to keep more vaccines at home here for European citizens rather than let them go out onto the global market. Would you say that's a way where the EU is kind of again reprioritizing health in the decisions it's making? Because certainly when it comes to export bans, those come with risks. There are consequences. There are political consequences for Europe. There's potentially trade consequences in the future. So could you tell us a bit about that kind of weighing or balancing exercise that Europe has made now and in the end decided to impose export bans anyways?
Yeah, I think that they just don't have a grip on the export of vaccines right now, and they can't get it under control. So I think that there's I don't know if it's necessarily a health reason alone that they're doing this. I also think it's trying to reestablish trust. So getting the vaccine for Europeans was a major political move by the EU, right? They could really show their added benefit here. And this is what you saw in the beginning when they first did the joint procurement. We saw Ursula von der Leyen, we're getting this done, we're getting you the vaccine. And so again, health is really this great political capital to show citizens that you're doing something for them and you make a difference. And now, obviously everybody's now blaming the EU for the bad rollout. Or for the slow rollout. And so again, I think also for keeping this kind of unity that they had, right, and the solidarity that was going on in the beginning of the outbreak, they need to hold on to that, so they need to stand strong. And as you see in politics, usually the internal politics come first, and then the rest, unless it's too risky. But I think you have to be strong and stand together first before you can be strong in your external relations. Yeah.
How does all of this fit into the research that's being done at the Law Center for Health and Life?
Yeah, so we at the Law Center for Health and Life, we really look at the interaction of law, health, and life. So law, health, and the living environment. And we look at that in two directions. So on the one hand, what is the impact of law and regulation on health? And we use frames like legal epidemiology to do that. And on the other hand, we look at what is the impact of all of the ways that we have now to try and be healthy. So some of these public health interventions, but also what is being done in the healthcare sector, for instance, introducing artificial intelligence in medical decision making. And how does that affect the existing patients' rights and legal safeguards that are there in the field of health?
In the second part of this podcast, we'll discuss the role of Europe in global vaccines policy. But before we do, I'd like to dive into vaccine research and development, which is at the root of vaccine shortages. In the last few decades, many governments have stopped developing and producing vaccine, leaving these important tasks up to pharmaceutical companies. Companies are accountable to shareholders who often seek to maximize their profits. Generally, developing a vaccine for a future outbreak is risky business. There is the scientific uncertainty, and on top of that, there's the risk that there won't be a market for a new vaccine if there is no disease outbreak. Now, COVID-19 has been a game changer for financing vaccines. It spurred governments worldwide to invest heavily in developing and pre-ordering COVID-19 vaccines. And despite these public investments of millions of euros, COVID-19 vaccines are still treated like a commodity and not a public good. This has to do with the incentives shaping drug development and trade in international law. To dive deeper into the global health policy influencing COVID-19 vaccines, I caught up with Professor Suerie Moon, Director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. It's great to be with you virtually, and I would really like to know from you what the major developments are on the global health landscape with regards to vaccine development and production in this pandemic. Can you orient us a bit and identify which major developments we should be paying attention to going forward?
Yes, so thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think if we look at what's been happening with vaccine R&D for COVID-19, there are a few key features that are important to recognize. First is, as many people have observed, this is a vaccine development in record time. And this is definitely something to be, very pleased about. I think perhaps what's less widely understood is how much the public sector has been really driving and shepherding this process, and that we see the public sector both pushing R&D forward by putting billions of dollars or euros into research and development, pulling it by committing to advanced purchase agreements, but also facilitating it in the middle, whether that's scaling up of manufacturing or making sure that key bottlenecks get worked through or providing technical assistance. We see the public sector has accompanied vaccine R&D every step of the way. And it's not only a national initiative, it's also very much, it's a global effort to develop vaccines quickly. We now have about 300 vaccine candidates in development. This is unprecedented, I think, this mobilization of scientific and technological capacity. I think the second big feature is the ambition. The level of global ambition, I think, has probably never been so high. There is, on the part of political leadership, a clearly articulated desire to vaccinate the world. I think there is support for the norm that everybody should have access to vaccines. The big problem, of course, is translating that ambition into reality, and this is where we have seen major inequalities and inequities. I think it's now widely known that many countries haven't had a single vaccine or are likely to have to wait years before they can fully immunize their populations, particularly developing countries. And so we've not been able to realize the global ambitions with the institutions that have that we've created, oftentimes overnight, to try to address this situation.
Thank you. So we're seeing a very ambitious time, and I'm wondering, how does this relate to the talk around the pandemic treaty or a potential pandemic treaty in the future? What might such a treaty look like, and how could it really help us address these roadblocks that we're encountering now with regards to unequal distribution of vaccines, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one of the reasons I think that we have this inequality today is that we weren't prepared to develop, produce, and get vaccines out to everybody who needs them. And so one of the key ideas behind a pandemic treaty is indeed to be better prepared with binding rules and much more sort of firm commitments, both financially as well as industrially, than certainly that we had pre-2020. I think that, I have to recognize that those who've been really pushing to create COVAX overnight have done a tremendous job building the airplane while flying it, as has been said. But everybody recognizes that's not a great way to fly. And so the idea of a pandemic treaty is indeed to build the airplane first. And I think that it's important to note that the European Council, in putting forward this proposal for a pandemic treaty, has actually highlighted innovation and access to countermeasures, as they're broadly called, as a key priority. And this is, of course, I think both because of the global ambition to make sure everyone can have access in the future, but also because of the problems that Europe has seen at home. And I think this is not a coincidence that the struggle to get access to enough vaccines in a reliable way to vaccinate populations even within the EU, and all of the stumbling blocks and challenges that we've seen here in Europe, this has strengthened the commitment on the part of the EU leadership to actually build a better plane for the future. I think we are lucky that we're not starting from scratch. There have been some very important foundational debates on what used to be referred to as a research and development treaty. Already for 15 plus years, this has been an idea that has been debated quite actively in the global health community. And I think we see in the pandemic treaty an opportunity to, I think, put some of those ideas into action. I think there are two key ideas that are at the heart of what used to be called, as I said, the R&D treaty. The first is financing. You need countries to put money on the table, and this has to come. The burden sharing should be equitable, meaning all countries need to contribute in some way, but of course some countries will be expected to contribute more than others. But it's got to be something that's reliable, and so that the money will be there when we need it. I think the second thing is, if you can find ways to jointly finance the research and development, the manufacturing, the distribution of vaccines, then we'll have a much stronger chance of having equitable, rapid access at the end of the day. And I think this is why I really emphasize that the binding obligations to finance and to invest in R&D and to take on that risk, really to share that risk early on, is really a precondition, I would say, to having a successful rollout and a much more equitable distribution of vaccines, afterwards. And so if a treaty can address that problem, and it's a big if, this is not an easy political or economic problem to solve, then I think we will be in a better position in the future.
I see. So what the pandemic treaty could bring us that we don't have yet is this binding obligation for financing and for sharing the risks upfront.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key differences we can already observe between the way the US and the EU approached vaccine R&D is that, ironically enough, I think some people would be surprised to find that the US government was far more interventionist. They intervened much more aggressively in the market very early on, and they exhibited much more willingness to take on risk. And they plugged more money at the earlier stages into R&D, directed where should that R&D go, made sure that R&D happened, made sure manufacturing scale-up happened, of course made sure that they would be priority customers in terms of getting some of the vaccines that would be expected to come out of the other side of the pipeline. And as a result, they did get, I think, faster access at the end of the day. European Union actually put more money on the table. The European Union actually put, I think, about 1.5 times as much money on the tail end, on the procurement side, as the US, but it came later. And that means that they were less willing to take on the risk earlier on. And as a result, I think we're seeing some of the challenges today in terms of Europe being further behind in getting, on the ground vaccines that can be rolled out to patients. So I think one of the conclusions you can draw from this is that if governments are willing to put money on the table at risk, as you said, and really steer that innovation process and the manufacturing process, they will reap the rewards at the end of the day. And this is not something that we can leave to markets, and it's not something we can leave to single countries alone. Then you'll have the chaotic situation that we're in today.
And do you think when it comes to the EU, because that's a really nice comparison that you've drawn between the US and the EU responses, when it comes to the EU, is this something that the EU needs to do as a global actor on an international scale in the scope of something like a pandemic treaty? Is this also something it needs to be doing on its home front? Where should it be directing its efforts? And how likely is it that the lessons we've learned now are going to translate into action from the European Union in the future?
And we saw it first in the spring of 2020, when the EU successfully negotiated among its member states to not have export bans inside the Union, while of course permitting export bans outside the Union. And this is where we see both the possibilities of regional action, but the limits when we look at this from a global perspective. And we see this again with vaccines. Really impressive solidarity to try to make sure all member states get equal access to vaccines within the EU, but this has come at a cost, I think, to the EU being able to live up to its global commitments to make sure everybody else in the world gets access to vaccines. And so that I do think that it's quite clear in the discussions around a health emergency, HERA, I think the acronym is Health Emergency and Response Agency. I'm not sure I got the acronym right. But the idea that the EU would create an entity that could act more like the way the US government acted, meaning putting money early into R&D, putting money early into manufacturing, putting money into the access arrangements that come at the end. Having an entity that can do that at the EU level, I think, has already gotten quite a lot of political support. And that, to me, is an encouraging sign that they are taking the lessons quite seriously. What I haven't seen yet is a clear commitment that something like a HERA, an EU HERA, would think globally and not just regionally, that it would build in guarantees for global access to any products that might be supported with EU money. And there is certainly a strong ethical argument for why the EU should be thinking globally, but there's also a strong self-interest argument. And we know that the EU economy, that the EU epidemic, that the ability of EU citizens to travel, all of this relies on getting pandemics under control globally. And so I think this combination of self-interest and let's say a more altruistic or other-oriented set of principles or commitments would be strong enough to persuade the EU to indeed act both regionally and globally.
I see. Well, this has been a great overview of changes that we've seen from the EU, some encouraging developments, but also the road that's left to be traveled if we want to get more equitable distribution of vaccines globally, and the role that the EU could play in that. So I'd really like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Suerie. In today's podcast on access to COVID-19 vaccines, we heard how sufficient government financing for drug research and development, production, and purchasing is an essential part of pandemic response. International and European law and policy have a major role to play in the equitable access to pandemic vaccines. I'm Katrina Perehudoff, and this has been a podcast from the Law Center for Health and Life at the University of Amsterdam. In this series, we look at societal changes at the intersection of law, human health, and our living environment. Follow us on social media to learn more.